Okay, Chapter 6, Marine and Coastal Systems and Resources. So the start is the case study, like always, and in this case it's talking about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is sometimes abbreviated GPGP, which is just this giant, it says a sea of plastic in the middle of the ocean. So ocean plastics are made a huge problem in ocean pollution. They get caught up in gyres, which is a term that you should know, which are circular rotations. We talked about this a little bit the other day. But it's, the water is being pushed to the side and it rotates because it hits the land and because the earth is rotating. And so it kind of makes this swirl and then all the plastic gets caught in the middle. And these are microplastics. So yeah, you might see like a water bottle or something like that. But in general, it's tiny little pieces of plastic, sometimes even too small to be seen. And they get eaten by plankton, and then the plankton get eaten by other animals, and it just accumulates up the food chain. So it's a major problem. It keeps going, and then it starts with 16.1 about the oceans. This part right here, though, is going back to the garbage patch, the plastic patch. You should know this figure and caption. You should know how plastics affect oceans and wildlife. So it can entangle them, which a lot of people have seen. There are microplastics that get in their stomachs. This is another one where an organism has ingested so much plastic that it died from it. And then this is talking about preventing it. So you should know how it affects wildlife. Then it gets into the ocean and starts talking about what does the seafloor look like. And so that's the next page. You should know this figure and the parts of the ocean. This part right here is called the continental shelf. It's where the shallow water is. And then you have the shelf slope break and the continental slope. In Finding Nemo, that was the drop off, right? And then you have the continental rise and the abyssal plain. And this is just the like flat kind of deep part of the ocean. The sediment accumulates on the bottom. You have an oceanic ridge here. Oceanic ridges, remember, are divergent plate boundaries where new seafloor is being made. And then you have a subducting zone here, and then you have a volcanic island arc. So a little bit of a review of that part from the previous chapter. And then you should know about, the saltiness of the ocean. The ocean salinity is about 3.5%, which is equivalent to 35 parts per thousand on average. This salinity is lower near the equator due to the large amount of rain. So the influx of fresh water dilutes the saltiness. And it is higher at about 30 to 35 degrees, which is around where we are, because it's warm and the water it's still warm and the water evaporates, and so you get a saltier ocean kind of in those latitudes. You should know about water's high heat capacity. Hopefully you remember that from chemistry. This influences coastal climates. It is warmer at the coast than it will be inland because the heat retained in the water will actually stay, and keep heat in the air too. So it'll be warmer at the coast than it will be sometimes inland. You should know these currents, not all of them, but you should kind of have the gist of what they look like. This is a picture of the currents. The two that you really should know are the Gulf Stream. So this is right here where we are on the East Coast. So this warm water from the equator comes this way, hits North America, and it goes up along the coast, and then somewhere around the mid-Atlantic, it turns to the east, and it goes up here. And this is why Northern Europe in this area is actually still kind of warm compared to, if you think about it, it's really about the same latitude as Alaska, but it stays warm because of that current carrying heat, carrying hot water and hot air with it. You should know the California current, which is on the west coast, and it is a cold water current because it is coming south from the polar region. So if you've ever actually been swimming in the Pacific, it's actually quite cold, even though the air is very warm, and that's because it's bringing that polar water with it. On the next page, you should know this term upwelling. Right here, upwelling is why most life in the ocean is near the coasts and in the photic zone. And so there's this picture here. You should know the steps in upwelling. You've got wind blowing along the coastline. This is the California coast, so it's blowing from the north. And then you have because of that wind, it's pushing this water away. So the surface water is getting pushed away. And since that leaves kind of like an empty space here, this cold, deeper water will upwell and you will get nutrient-rich, colder water off the coast, which leads to good fishing. You should also know what downwelling is, which is basically kind of the exact opposite of upwelling. Over here, you should know the term thermohaline, and this picture kind of relates to that. That is basically just all of the currents on the planet working together to maintain a somewhat constant temperature on the surface of the Earth. So unlike other planets where maybe it's very, very cold at the poles and warm at the equator, or cold on the dark side when the sun is not shining, we have all of these currents, and when we look at the atmosphere, we'll look at that too, that are just kind of moving heat around the planet and keeping it somewhat moderate all over. You should also know ENSO, which is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and this is the shift in atmospheric pressure and sea temperature that causes poor fishing off the coast of California and South America. So that we talked about, or if we haven't yet, we're going to talk about the El Nino conditions. Normal conditions, you have the upwelling that we were just talking about. In an El Nino year, the winds, just for whatever reason, it doesn't get as warm. And so you don't have the upwelling going on. That cold water stays below the surface. And so the warmth, instead of it being cold, nutrient-rich water off the coast, it will be warm water. That leads to more evaporation, which leads to more rain. So you get more rain in an El Nino year, you get more storms, and you have poor fishing, which could actually be economically devastating for developing countries. Then this is talking about, can we predict where the garbage patches are? It's worth reading. But then we get to this next section on marine and coastal ecosystems. We looked at this in our previous unit on biomes. You should know this figure in the zones for intertidal. So supertidal, intertidal, subtidal for the intertidal zones on that biome. We talked about salt marshes, mangrove forests. For these two, you should know how salt marshes, which are generally in temperate climates, and mangrove forests, which are in tropical climates, provide ecological and environmental benefits. They buffer the coastline, they keep it from storm surges, they provide habitat for a lot of the things that we eat, like shrimp and shellfish and things like that. So you should know those benefits. Estuary is the wetland where a river meets the ocean. It has brackish water, which is part fresh and part salt, and that varies based on the tides and the wind and the rain and things like that. So sometimes the estuary can be saltier than other times. And then we get into corals. These are very important. They're mainly tropical, although there are some temperate coral reefs. They are mutualistic with an organism called zooxanthellae, which is an algae that is sensitive to temperature and pollution. And if the conditions are not right, it can leave the coral, and that's what we call bleaching. So the color in the coral actually comes from the zooxanthellae. So when they leave, the coral becomes white, it loses its color, and so we say it's bleached. It's not really bleached though. On the next page, we get into the benefits of coral. It's biodiversity. It's one of the most biodiverse regions in an ocean. It serves as a nursery for fish because it's protected, so the fish lay their eggs there and the babies can grow up safe. They absorb wave energy. As the waves come in, they kind of hit against the reef and they lose their energy. And they're also tourism. Like there's a lot of money in snorkeling and expeditions to coral reefs. Should know the threats to coral reefs. Fishing techniques, which are going to be later in this chapter, sometimes they're cut for shipping passage. So if it's blocking a port or a shipping lane, they will cut through the coral so that the ships don't run into it. Sewage and toxins, corals, like I just said on the previous page, and the zooxanthellae are very sensitive to that. And also ocean acidification, which we're going to get into later in this chapter as well. When you're looking at the open ocean, you should know some things. You should know the zones. You should know the photic zone. That's near the top where the light penetrates, and that's where all the photosynthesis and phytoplankton goes on. Should know the intertidal zone, which we talked about before. The pelagic zone, which is kind of just like the between the ocean surface and the floor, and that's where like free swimming animals are. So like sharks and fish are swimming around in the pelagic zone. And then the benthic zone, which is the seafloor, the bottom. So animals that kind of live on the ocean floor are in the benthic zone. Then we get to the next section on marine pollution, which is very important, but there's not much in this first little bit. When we turn the page, still talking some more about plastics in the ocean, because that is really one of the #1 sources of marine pollution. So you should know this figure and caption and everything to do with that. Then we get over to oil spills, which are also a pretty serious form of pollution in the ocean. The #1 source of oil pollution, though, that a lot of people don't know is natural seeps. So there are just little cracks in the seafloor that the oil seeps up through, and that is the #1 source of oil pollution. But there have also been some catastrophic oil spills. One that you should know is the Deepwater Horizon spill. You should know when, where, and what the problems were with it. This was an oil platform where they were drilling for oil, and there was an explosion and just gallons and gallons, I don't even know how many, but it's in here, I could look, I guess, spilled out into the Gulf of Mexico, and it caused dead zones, and it washed up on the shore, and it smelled really bad. It ruined the tourism in the area. You should know the U.S. Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which is actually on the next page, but there's also other ones on the next page, so I wanted to have room. And you should know its provisions. So that's right here, the Oil Pollution Act. One of the main provisions for this is that tankers, so like the Exxon Valdez was a major spill where an oil tanker ran aground and the hull was punctured. Tankers are now required to be double hulled. So if there's a hole in the hull, there's still an inner hull that keeps the oil from spilling out. Toxic pollutants can contaminate seafood. So once it gets in there, it goes up the food chain. It can make people sick. It can make other animals sick that eat them. And excess nutrients. We talked about eutrophication before, but there's another type of bloom that happens, a harmful algal bloom. It's called a red tide. And this happens from what are called dinoflagellates. So dinoflagellates, and the nutrients go in, and it's just the conditions are right for them, for their population to explode, and they actually produce a toxin. And so if you go in that water and then you drink it, or it can kill people. It can kill animals, birds, fish, things like that, and people have died from this as well. Another one is called domoic acid, which comes off the coast of California. And that one is just another overgrowth because of excess nutrients. This is talking about light and sound pollution, which is kind of important. Sonar can often, like Navy sonar, can interfere with whales navigation and things like that. So that's also considered a form of pollution. Then we get into climate change and how it's altering the ocean chemistry. And that's where you get into ocean acidification. And this is super, super important. What happens is that all the CO2 from burning fossil fuels goes up into the atmosphere. And a sink for CO2 is the ocean. So it will dissolve in the ocean water. And when it dissolves in the ocean water, it reacts with the water to make carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. And this lowers the pH of the ocean. So animals with shells made of calcium carbonate, which is CaCO3, such as corals and other bivalves, their shells actually begin to dissolve. There is some hope, though. They are seeing that some animals are able to resist. I guess the species is evolving to resist the acidified ocean. But right now, it's a major problem. Then when we turn to the page, talking about emptying the oceans, this is where we are overfishing, and we are doing this significantly. One of the predictions is that in the next 20 years, 90% of the fish will be eliminated from the ocean due to overfishing. And this could be devastating to developing countries, especially a lot of Asian countries who rely on fish for protein. Because a country like Japan doesn't have the land to graze cows or pigs or things like that. And so their main protein source is often fish or shellfish. And we are overfishing so much that it's a food security issue for a lot of countries. And it shows you here that this is the wild fisheries catch, and then this is aquaculture, which is when you farm fish. So you grow them in tanks on land. Then it gets into fishing technology. And the reason that we have overfished the ocean so much now is that fishing technology has gotten very sophisticated. They use sonar, they use satellites, they use thermal sensing systems to find schools of fish. And originally, the first result of this is higher catches. And so people were super excited. But then the second result is that the population crashes. And I thought there was a graph, but I don't. I think that was in a previous. Okay, so like here, the catches got very, very high, and then the population crashed. So that was kind of the result. You need to know these methods of fishing. There's purse seining here, which is like, again, if you saw Finding Nemo, when they all got caught in that one net and the net closed over them. There is drift netting, which is just a net that kind of hangs down in the water and the fish swim into it and they get caught on their gills. There's long lining, which are there's a whole bunch of baited hooks on a long line that is floating on the surface, and so the fish come and get caught that way. And then bottom trawling, which is really, really devastating for the benthic zone and the animals that live on the bottom, because they just drag this weighted net and it like rips up and breaks everything on the bottom. Another term that you should know is the term bycatch, which means fish that were caught by accident in these. So like in here, back in the day, they used to catch a lot of sea turtles and dolphins accidentally, and they would drown because once the net closed, they weren't able to get to the surface to breathe. And so there's a lot of things being done now to eliminate bycatch. Okay, hang on. So this part right here, again, more about the garbage patch, but then when we come over here to the overfishing, these two graphs are talking about cod harvests. Cod used to be an incredibly economic boosting fish in the US. In fact, like the Revolutionary War was in part funded by cod sales. So it's an incredibly important fish. And the Grand Banks and the Georges Banks are two areas of fishery, is an area where you can find a certain type of fish. So there's the Grand Banks fishery, and people would take their boats and they would go out to this region of the ocean and they would pretty reliably find cod. Then when those new technologies that I talked about on the previous page came into play, somewhere around the 50s and 60s, their catches just went up and up and up, and people were getting quite wealthy and they were getting very greedy. And then the population just tanked because there weren't enough enough fish to replenish the supplies over time. In 1992 here, when it was almost completely collapsed, they imposed a moratorium on fishing in the Grand Banks. And you can see even up till now that it hasn't really recovered. And then here's Georges Bank. And then this is again, like there's a catch and then a crash and then a catch and then a crash and then a catch and then a crash. And at that point they closed Georges Bank as well. And it's been, it's really struggling to recover from that. You should know the term aquaculture, which is raising of fish and seafood, almost entirely on land, but sometimes it's done in the ocean in pens. But it's a way of like fishing, raising fish in a farming sort of way. Some of the changes that have occurred because of overfishing, fishing is harder now and it is more dangerous. People are often fishing illegally, which becomes, an enforcement issue, and or people will sometimes resort to violence to not get caught. And people are now eating less desirable fish, which is kind of, I guess a question of taste, but it's talking about fishing down the food chain. We used to eat like the highest, best quality fish, and they got overfished, and then they moved down to the next best level, and so on and so on. And now people are eating fish that back 50 or 60 years ago were considered junk fish. I wrote this again. I forgot I had it previously, but you really need to know the term bycatch, which is on this page. It's super important, which is just the accidental capture of animals while fishing. So it could be other things than fish, and it accounts for millions of fish, sharks, marine mammals, and birds each year. And then it's talking about some of the fishing methods. You should know what is being done with each kind of fishing. So the methods that I talked about a couple pages back over here, you should know what they're doing to fix the problems with each of those. And so that's right there on 445 and the next page. Then we get on to marine conservation. And so what people, one more thing. This is a picture of a before and after bottom trawling at Georges Bank. You can see there's corals and anemones and urchins and sand dollars, and this is actually a big flounder right here. And afterwards, it's just scraped clean. There's nothing there. So trawling is kind of a terrible way of fishing. Okay, when we get back to conservation now, you should know this idea of maximum sustainable yield. This is the number of fish that can be caught and still leave enough to reproduce for next year's catch. So this is done through quotas and fishing licenses and size limits. So if a fish is too small, you have to put it back. And sometimes no female fish. So you leave the females to breed and you only catch male fish and things like that. So you always want to make sure that you leave enough behind to reproduce for the next year. And so some of the ways that we do this were another way of protecting fisheries are marine protected areas, which are kind of like national parks in the middle of the ocean. They're on this map. And it's just an area where people can't fish. They can't, they allow some tourism activities, but not fishing or anything that extracts wildlife from there. And then also this idea of marine reserves, which is an area where there's no fishing allowed, and it keeps a breeding population intact. And fishermen were very against this initially, but if you read this, you should know that how reserves benefit fishermen actually ended up being a net benefit. The populations bounced back. They were healthier. They were better, there was more biodiversity, and it ended up now that fishermen are actually in support of all of these, most fishermen are in support of these methods. And then it wasn't in the chapter, but I think that this is something that's important. It used to be in a previous edition of the book, so I added it here at the end. When there is an oil spill, there are some ways to clean up oil spills. They use things called booms, which are basically, if you can picture like a big pool noodle floating around behind a boat, and they use it to kind of corral the oil. So they actually can push the oil, since it's floating on the surface of the ocean, they can push it into one area so it's more concentrated, and then it can be sucked up by skimmer boats, or they can put genetically modified bacteria on it that digest the oil. They also can put chemical dispersants on it, which break the oil into smaller components. But at the moment, we really don't know the long-term effects of the chemical dispersant on things like plankton and other organisms that live there. So sucking it up physically, like almost with a vacuum, really is kind of the best way right now. All right, so that's chapter 16.